Hello, and welcome to Religion and Life. I'm your host, Ozzie Ostwalt, and this week we'll be focusing on the fiction of Randall Keenan, a well-known Southern writer. Our guests are Dr. Bruce Dick and Mark Powell, both of the Department of English here at ASU, and they'll be joining the conversation as we talk about spirituality and religion in the fiction of Mr. Keenan. Welcome, gentlemen. I appreciate you both joining me today.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
All right. Bruce, let's start with you. Randall Keenan is a Southern writer. He's also an African-American writer, and you're our resident expert on African-American literature over in the Department of English. So I'd like to ask you how you might use Randall Keenan's work in your classes, where his work kind of falls within the overall canon of African-American literature.
Okay. Maybe the second question first.
Sure.
As you probably know, the African-American tradition is an old tradition. It goes all the way back to 1745 with the first poet, Lucy Terry, who wrote a poem that was published actually in the 1800s called Bar's Flight. But that poem is important because it was written in heroic couplets, which was the style at the time. And what she proved and what Phyllis Wheatley proved with the first book of poetry by an African-American that came out in 1773 was that given entrance into the dominant culture, which was the white culture at the time, which meant an education, which meant literacy, they too proved that they could also write in the heroic couplets of the time. So they're real significant publications that go back to the 1700s. So that tradition evolves over the next century, particularly. In the 1850s is a rich time in African American literature. We typically don't acknowledge that because even though you're in religious studies, you probably remember some of the heavyweights that you remember reading in the 1850s, Whitman, Poe, Melville, Hawthorne, Dickinson, and those kind of writers.
But not an African American writer.
Not African American writers typically listed. And you know, the beginning of the African American short story started in the 1850s. The first novel by an African American male, first novel by an African American female came out in 1849.
So that tradition goes way back. What novel was that in 1849?
The Bondsman's Daughter.
The Bondsman's Daughter.
The Bondsman's Daughter.
Yeah.
That was recently rediscovered. So that tradition goes through the 19th century and into the 20th century. So a lot of times I end up with Randall's Let the Dead Bury Their Dead. This is the second publication, a book of short stories. It was published in 1992. And I have taught Visitation of the Spirits once in a 4,000 level class, but felt kind of flat, and maybe I didn't know it as well as I might know it today, but that's where Keenan usually figures in my classes.
And he was on campus recently. I think you had an opportunity to sit down with him and listen to some of his readings. Any new insights from that visit?
Well, Mark and I did go to both of his appearances. He did a craft talk, which is pretty typical of our visiting writers. They usually do a craft talk on Thursdays at 3:30. Before the reading at 7:30, and one of my classes attended the craft talk. That was inspirational, and he talked a lot about how his work figures into the Southern Gothic tradition, which was a new angle from my class, which was nice. And then he did a reading that night at 7:30, and it was somewhat difficult to follow because it was written in a nonlinear tradition, which is a style that he typically uses. Sometimes he writes in magical realism. So to have those combined and then to read without the text, listening to him read, sometimes it was difficult to follow, but it was an enjoyable moment all the way around.
We might return to the idea of his work being part of the Southern Gothic tradition if we have time at the end, but I wanted to pick up on a couple of other things you said. He sometimes writes in magical realism, and that's a characteristic of Visitation of Spirits, for example. And Mark, maybe I'll turn to you here. It seems to me that one of the characteristics of Keenan's work is that it's infused with spirituality and religion. Visitation of Spirits is one example. You were telling me earlier that you had a kind of anecdotal experience of reading Keenan for the first time that might shed some light on the appearance of religion in his work.
Yeah, I did, Ozzie. So I read, it was a very visceral response, and I read Keenan, I guess, for the first time about a decade after Let the Dead Bury Their Dead was published, so the early 2000s. And I was pretty young at the time. I read A Visitation of Spirits, and then I immediately read the second book. And I was struck, I guess, by three things. all of which I had seldom encountered in Southern literature. I had read the Latin American magical realist before, so I was certainly familiar with this notion. But what I had never encountered in U.S. literature, and particularly Southern literature, was magical realism infused with this spirituality. And what I immediately responded to was, it was the first time I had read something that conjured the world in which I had grown up in. And I mean by that, the elders in a small rural church in South Carolina who spoke as if there was no line between the physical world and the spiritual world, no line between the living and the dead. There was no attempt to convince you. There was no concern about how people might respond to this. This is simply how the world was. And when I read that in Keenan for the first time, there was this incredible shock of recognition. So there was that. And then there was a couple other things too. One is just the complexity of the religious vision. Bruce and I were talking about this earlier. It's this incredible sort of syncretism. There's traditional Southern conservative Christianity. There's African religion. Keenan seems to draw from these sources very freely. Right. So there's that complexity, but then within that complexity, there's this total absence of judgment, which is kind of stunning when you think of Keenan, an African-American gay man in the South, right? I mean, how many Southern writers, particularly African-American writers in the 20th century, left the South not to return, or to return very infrequently, and are any writers of any race leaving the rural South? He writes about Timms Creek as this locale that his fiction is set in so beautifully, and it's clearly a sort of conservative place, but he doesn't cast any judgment on it in a sort of contemporary, in a explicit way, right? There are all sorts of implicit conclusions that are drawn, but all of those things struck me on first reading them. Particularly just this idea that I didn't associate with literature in the United States, that we are freely moving constantly between this corporeal world and this incorporeal thing. And I don't know many writers that do that.
Let's talk about that just a little bit more. That is kind of characteristic of Keenan's work, and of course Keenan's describing the black church from his experience, and also, as you said, African spirituality, yet it struck a chord with your experience in, I guess, predominantly white Southern evangelical tradition, if I'm correct. So is this a point of contact, a point of commonality in the South that kind of reaches across black and white evangelical traditions, you think? Or
yeah, I certainly think so, right? And maybe this is less so because I think he's conjuring a world, in the world in which I grew up with, up until maybe like before the moral majority began to shift everything in Southern churches toward the political.
Right.
And maybe I might be exaggerating somewhat, but not by a lot, I think. So maybe that has created this sort of divide that might even be an abyss between white and black evangelical experiences. But the common ground that maybe still exists, and certainly existed in my experience, was this kind of open spirituality, where was this movement between the two. It's rich ground for a writer, I think, and I think Keenan is clear evidence of that, right? Growing up in that sort of world fires the imagination in ways that I think is completely lost on people who grow up in a completely non-religious environment.
Right. You used the word conjure, which is interesting use of that word, because in A Visitation of Spirits, that's exactly what happens. The protagonist tries to conjure up spirits. Bruce, is this kind of connection to the conjure and to African spirituality particularly characteristic of African American literature across the board, or is Keenan unusual in this sense?
I'm not sure about across the board, but certainly it goes back into the 1700s. Going back to Phyllis Wheatley's first book that I mentioned, it's called On Various Subjects, Religious and Moral. And she has a poem in there called On Being Brought from Africa to America. And it's two stanzas, and the first stanza is, "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. My heart redemption neither sought nor knew." And Phyllis Wheatley is an interesting case because she was a slave when she was 12 years of age and in Africa, and she was brought to the States. And she was raised by the Wheatleys, who had two daughters, and they also let Phyllis into the family, and she got an education. So it's interesting when you look at that particular poem, how she's dismissing her African roots as being pagan, and until she came over here and became a Christian, was she able to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. But there's just countless references throughout the 19th and 20th century. Richard Wright is a major research focus of mine, and he was a card-carrying communist for 13 years, and even as a communist, he knew his Bible well, because growing up in the Deep South, in Mississippi and Memphis, Tennessee, he had to recite biblical passages correctly at the dinner table, and if he did not, he would be beat over the head with the Bible. So he quotes religious passages all the way throughout his work. He died in 1960. You come up to somebody like Alice Walker in The Color Purple. Is a really interesting story of two sisters who were separated. Nettie, the younger sister, goes to Africa as a missionary, Christian missionary, and she is, kind of taken into the African culture there, but realizes that trying to be a missionary and convert these different peoples that she encounters to a Christian belief might not be the right thing.
Right.
So you're seeing this kind of idea played out in a lot of different literatures.
Right. Well, something I want to address to both of you is that how Keenan treats race in his novels, and is there a connection between religion, both in the formal sense when he depicts traditional religions in his work, and in a more informal sense when he has these elements of African spirituality? Is there a connection in any of that to the way he treats or depicts race in the South in his stories? To either one of you, yeah.
That's a wonderful question, Bruce. You.
Well, one of the things we haven't mentioned is a subject matter that Keenan deals a lot with in both his works of fiction. And he's an openly gay writer, and he's done 3 books on James Baldwin, who in the 1950s, another African-American writer who was openly gay came out and said, "I'm gay. I told you, now what are you going to say?" And it was just a great statement that really kind of paved the way for future writers like Keenan. And you have this kind of internal struggle in Visitation of the Spirits, as you know, with Horace Cross, who's trying to come to terms with his identity, his homosexual identity, in a very religious, conservative Thames Creek, African-American Thames Creek. And he's being haunted by demons, and it's not a good finish, as you know. I won't spoil it for your viewers if they haven't read the book, but it's not a happy ending. And I'm not sure if spiritualism, in that sense, in that book, is an answer, nor does it seem to be an answer in Let the Dead Bury Their Dead.
Well, it seems to me, in the case of Horace at least, that the traditional religion fails him in his effort to deal with his sexual orientation and his homosexuality.
And some of those same characters that reappear in Let the Dead Bury Their Dead, because all of his fiction is set in Thames Creek, so a lot of other characters are coming in to play. As far as race, and one of the things he deals with this homosexual theme is interracial relationships. So, it's even another factor that ties into his discussions on race.
Right. Yeah, Mark?
Yeah, no, I think it's particularly important to remember that all of his fiction is set in Thames Creek, right? And we were able to talk to him a little bit about the novel he's working on, and it sounds like large portions of that are set there as well. I think of another Baldwin quote. Baldwin said, "In a society that so cherishes freedom of speech, it's astounding how few individuals actually speak." And there's something about the representation of this place that would otherwise be forgotten, this fictional Thames Creek, which is clearly based on some Keenan's own experience. Just the dailiness of the lives that exist in the fiction. It reminds me of O'Connor's quote that if there's going to be grace, it's going to come from the ground up. It's going to come, right, not as a reprieve from the everyday, but in the everyday. And there's really, particularly in the stories, I think there's a loveliness that comes out of following people, not just through these incredible spiritual battles, that happen that are fascinating and entertaining to read about, but just the everydayness of their life. And there's something really beautiful about that. I'm not sure what it says about race, except that it depicts people in a way that makes them really human and really recognizable.
Well, one of the things that Randall Keenan said in an interview once was that he had kind of three philosophical influences: Calvinism, fundamentalism, and existentialism. Right? And try to put those three together, I think you get kind of that everydayness that you were speaking of. And by existentialism, I think he meant contingency. So is that part of the kind of Southern African American experience that comes out in Timms Creek when he writes about these everyday experiences of the characters in his novel?
I think so. I would probably argue that contingency is the heart of all true religion. Right? The intensity that comes with. I think of the poet and the theologian Christian Wyman, who said Christ is contingent.
Right.
Right. And I think that applies almost universally across various faiths. The idea that, this contingency. I don't know where to go with that, except it's certainly present throughout the stories and in the novel as well.
Yeah, also another factor that you see in Let the Dead Bury Their Dead. You have the Horace Cross character who's dealing with this religious community in Timms Creek, but you also, in Let the Dead Bury Their Dead, have one story in particular. I can't remember what it's called, maybe Foundations of the Earth, but a grandmother is dealing with the death of her grandson who had a relationship with a white male in Boston. The grandson is killed in an automobile wreck. So she's trying to come to terms with her Christian faith, dealing with her grandson's homosexuality, and he had to leave Timms Creek in order to be who he wanted to be. And the white partner's name is invited to Timms Creek to participate in kind of a post-funeral service. And it's the struggle of the grandmother trying to deal with her faith, and her faith has convinced her that homosexual acts are sinful, and she's trying to deal with that the whole time. Gabriel's name, I guess, has a biblical connection.
Sure. Yeah.
You see that quite often. So, it goes both ways in his fiction.
So the contingency theme kind of stretches across the character's status as African Americans in the South, the contingency between life and death. I think I read somewhere that when Randall was young, he was on the porch with a relative, and I think it was an uncle, and he died there in his presence, and that kind of made him afraid for a while of ghosts and the spirit world that comes out. So I think his characters are contingent, caught between life and death, caught between blackness and whiteness, somehow contingent in terms of sexual orientation and so forth.
Yeah, are you familiar with Let the Dead Bury Their Dead?
Yes.
Yeah, because almost all those stories deal with death in some form. The opening story, Clarence can speak to the dead. In the next story, you have the angel of death, Chi, coming to visit an older man, and on the last page, the man is dead and Chi is nowhere around. He's a stranger that comes in. And the death of the grandson, and then Let the Dead Bury Their Dead, the best story in that collection, in my opinion. In the end, you have the dead conversing with the living, and it's almost zombie-ish, in its context. So.
And of course, this is one of the things fiction can do for us, right? It can open up these alternative worlds and possibilities.
I think of the opening scene of A Visitation of Spirits, where, if you recall, I believe it's a grandmother who's slowly, laboriously coming down the steps into this cold yard to get in the back of the car. It's depicted, the physicality of it is just incredible, and you expect at any moment she's just going to collapse. She's going to once she's seated in that car and they begin to move through this landscape, a sort of shift happens, and she seems to almost acquire some kind of power. It begins to go interior in a way, and you begin to see that how she's incredibly frail physically, but there is this spiritual presence that begins to come as we look out across the landscape. We see birds moving across it. We see these heavy steel gray clouds hanging. And it's this remarkable movement that happens. And I think exactly what you're saying, Ozzie. The way that fiction can embody these larger themes, not by being explicit, but just by gesturing constantly at them.
Right.
Maybe writing in general, too, because we haven't mentioned his nonfiction work. And Keenan published a book, a very thick book, maybe 700 pages long, called Walking on Water, which was published in 1999. And it was like a 5 or 6 year project where he traveled around the United States and conversed with blacks and asked these people what it meant to be black in America today. And it's just a massive compilation. And in the beginning, he talks about how he apologizes because it's not really an oral history of these people, but more of a spiritual autobiography. Mm-hmm. So it really becomes a study about himself after having interviewed 200 or 300 people. So it seems to permeate much of his writing.
We're about out of time, but I just, maybe in a sentence or two, each of you could tell me the main takeaway for Randall Keenan. What stands out to you? What's his legacy so far? And maybe it's too early to talk about his legacy, but what does his writing bring to the overall picture of American literature, Southern literature, African American literature?
I think it brings this incredible nuance, particularly in African American literature, that you can see it now in the writing of people like Geronimo Johnson, Paul Beatty, T.R.E. Jones. I don't know that people would be writing, exploring Southern black rural lives, spirituality, in quite the same way if it wasn't for Keenan's work.
So he's a pioneer in that sense.
Absolutely.
Bruce?
Yeah, he's a bold writer, as has been said before, but I think it's a pretty bold first novel, Visitation of Spirits, about Horace trying to come to terms with his identity as homosexuality. And he's naked the entire novel. And it really, it takes place over a short period of time, but you don't really know that. But I like the nonlinear tradition that he writes in. It's no A plus B equals C conventional narrative structure. He's certainly experimental, and I also like the fact that he's not afraid to be an openly gay writer and deal with some tough subject matter as a gay black man in the South.
Right.
So.
Well, I want to thank you both so much. I mean, you've added to my knowledge of Randall Keenan. I love his work, and I think he's an important writer, and you've helped to explain some of those reasons. The thematic richness of his work, beautiful language he uses, the experimental methods he sometimes employs, all of that kind of feeds into his work, and I appreciate your willingness to help me work through some of these issues. So thank you very much, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining us on Religion and Life, brought to you by App TV. We'd like to thank our guests, Bruce Dick and Mark Powell, for stopping by this week. And on the next episode of Religion and Life, we'll be joined by Joseph Bethanti, Poet Laureate of North Carolina. And we'll hope you join us then. Until next time, this is Ozzie Ostwalt.